Every civilization has its stories. Some are written in stone, some whispered through generations, and some carefully rewritten to keep the story alive even when reality begins to crumble underneath it. Religion has done this better than almost any other force in history, not because it set out to deceive from the beginning, but because once a belief becomes the foundation of power, truth becomes negotiable. The rewriting doesn't always happen with malice. It often begins with devotion, a need to protect something sacred from the erosion of evidence, reason, or time. When ancient stories begin to clash with new discoveries, religious institutions face a choice: adapt or adjust the story so that it still fits. Most choose the second. Take the story of creation. For centuries, it was untouchable truth. The world was made in 6 days, humanity was molded from dust, and life began exactly as described. Then science arrived with fossils, carbon dating, and a universe billions of years old. The response wasn't open acceptance, it was reinterpretation. Suddenly, days didn't mean days anymore. Literal became symbolic. The story bent but never broke, because breaking it would mean letting go of authority. You can trace this pattern again and again: history reshaped, contradictions smoothed over, evidence selectively highlighted. When new information threatens the old order, religion doesn't rewrite its past because it's ignorant. It does so because it must survive. Every faith has its theologians who specialize not in discovering new truths, but in keeping old ones intact while pretending they've evolved. The early church, for instance, was a master of selective memory. Early Christianity wasn't one movement. It was dozens, competing, disagreeing, and often contradicting each other. Some believed Jesus was purely human, others thought he was divine from birth. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a metaphor. But by the time the New Testament was officially compiled, only one version of the story survived, and the rest were declared heresy. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and many others vanished from public view for centuries, not because they were proven false, but because they didn't fit the narrative the church wanted to preserve. And so history was rewritten, not by liars, but by editors who believed that truth could only be one thing, and anything that threatened unity was dangerous. They weren't trying to fool the world, they were trying to keep the story coherent enough to hold power. That's how you end up with a perfect gospel: 4 versions that appear to agree, only because dozens of others were erased. Religion's rewriting of history isn't confined to texts. It extends to people, events, and even entire civilizations. Take the ancient libraries: Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon. These were the centers of human knowledge long before Scripture claimed to contain all wisdom. When Christianity rose to dominance in the Roman Empire, many of these libraries were purged or abandoned. Texts that contradicted religious doctrine were burned, sometimes along with the scholars who wrote them. The loss wasn't accidental. It was a recalibration of history, a cleansing of inconvenient memory. But this isn't a story about Christianity alone. Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all have their own versions of the same impulse. The rewriting may not always come with fire and censorship. Sometimes it's softer, subtler, a quiet rebranding of the past. Stories evolve, uncomfortable details fade, and centuries later, believers are left with a version so polished that it feels eternal. Yet the real history, the messy, human, contradictory story behind it all, is buried under layers of reverence. What's fascinating is that this rewriting doesn't just preserve religion, it reshapes reality itself. When generations grow up hearing one story and never question its origins, the edited version becomes truth. Archaeological evidence might whisper another tale, but faith has a louder voice. People defend not what happened, but what they've been told happened. The emotional power of belief outweighs the discomfort of doubt. That's the quiet genius of religious storytelling. It doesn't just rewrite history, it replaces memory. Once rewritten, the new version isn't a lie, it's a lived truth, protected by ritual, repetition, and the fear of losing meaning. Every prayer, every sermon, every festival reinforces that edited narrative until it feels more real than anything uncovered by science or archaeology. And so, religion survives not by keeping the past intact, but by controlling what people remember about it. What was once myth becomes history. What was once myth rewritten again becomes revelation. It's not deceit, it's adaptation, disguised as divine constancy. One of the most striking examples comes from the history of Islam. The early Islamic centuries were turbulent, tribes vying for power, regional leaders asserting authority, and competing versions of the Prophet's life circulating. Over time, the stories were codified, edited, and sometimes sanitized to create a uniform narrative. Certain sayings and events were emphasized while others were downplayed or omitted entirely. Hadith collections, which record the Prophet's words, were meticulously filtered. Scholars judged which accounts were authentic and which were not, often influenced as much by politics as by evidence. What survives today is not a full record of what happened, but a curated selection designed to uphold the authority of the faith. Stories that threatened unity or contradicted later theological developments were quietly discarded. Entire chains of transmission were evaluated not just for accuracy, but for loyalty to the dominant perspective. The history we read now is the result of centuries of careful editing, designed to protect the religion's credibility and consistency. Judaism provides another example, though in a different form. The Hebrew Bible itself underwent centuries of compilation, redaction, and reinterpretation. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the events described in the Old Testament, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, the kingdoms of David and Solomon, are either exaggerated, reshaped, or selectively remembered. Centuries later, religious scholars and scribes edited texts to fit theological goals, smoothing contradictions and creating a continuous narrative that would support moral laws, religious authority, and national identity. History was not simply recorded, it was sculpted to preserve faith, culture, and authority. Even outside of written texts, religion rewrites history through commemoration and ritual. Saints and prophets are remembered selectively, often stripped of political or controversial aspects of their lives. Temples, churches, and mosques celebrate events that reinforce the narrative while ignoring evidence of conflict or moral ambiguity. Historical memory becomes a carefully curated gallery of images, painted to evoke devotion rather than accuracy. Sometimes the rewriting is subtle. Dates are adjusted, genealogies reconstructed, or mythic elements woven into historical events. Natural disasters or social upheavals are framed as divine punishment or moral lessons, not the consequences of politics or environment. In this way, religion creates a sense of inevitability. The past is righteous, the present is guided, and the future is secure. Even when human evidence tells a messier story, it's easy to dismiss these adjustments as harmless storytelling. But when history is selectively edited, society loses a vital tool for learning. By controlling the narrative, religious institutions maintain not only spiritual authority, but social and political power. They can frame victories as divine favor, failures as moral tests, and social hierarchies as natural or sacred. The rewritten past becomes a mechanism of control, ensuring that questioning faith feels like questioning civilization itself. Consider the way Christianity spread across Europe. Converting entire populations wasn't just a matter of preaching. It involved rewriting local histories and traditions. Pagan gods became saints, sacred sites were Christianized, and local customs were reinterpreted to align with Christian doctrine. History itself was remodeled layer by layer to make the new religion feel like a natural continuation rather than an imposition. Over generations, the original context faded, leaving only the narrative that reinforced ecclesiastical authority. Even in modern times, religious institutions continue to shape historical memory. Textbooks, museums, and cultural traditions often present sanitized versions of events, controversial episodes, wars, fought in the name of faith, the persecution of dissenters, corruption within religious leadership, are minimized or framed in ways that protect the institution's image. The public remembers the faith as timeless, virtuous, and harmonious, while the messy reality is quietly tucked away. Psychology helps explain why this works so effectively. Human memory is malleable, and repetition reinforces belief. When generations are raised with a consistent, curated story, it becomes internalized as truth. Ritual, art, and storytelling embed these narratives deeply into identity, creating a collective memory that resists contradictory evidence. Even when objective facts are presented, the emotional and cultural weight of the rewritten history often overrides rational analysis. This is why history is so powerful to religion. Controlling the past allows faith to control interpretation, morality, and authority. It transforms religion from a set of beliefs into a lens through which every aspect of reality is filtered. And while science, archaeology, and critical scholarship continue to reveal discrepancies, the revised narratives are resilient. They adapt, reinterpret, and survive, often in ways that make questioning faith feel unnatural or even threatening. Yet despite all these efforts, cracks appear. Archaeologists unearth texts, inscriptions, and artifacts that contradict long-held narratives. Scholars analyze discrepancies, trace redactions, and challenge the official story. The tension between evidence and narrative creates a fascinating dynamic. Religion must either evolve its story again or face the reality that parts of its past were manufactured, edited, or exaggerated. History, when uncurated, becomes both a threat and a teacher. And this is precisely why religious history is so intriguing. Every ritual, text, and tradition carries echoes of compromise, adaptation, and selective memory. What believers accept as eternal truths are often the product of centuries of editorial decisions, shaped by power, politics, and the human desire for coherence. Understanding this doesn't diminish the devotion or sincerity of practitioners. It simply reveals the mechanisms behind the stories that have survived. One of the more striking patterns in religious history is the selective erasure of inconvenient figures. Take, for example, early Christian leaders whose beliefs didn't align with the developing orthodoxy. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was a created being, not co-eternal with God. His views sparked intense debate and led to the Arian controversy. Eventually, Arianism was condemned as heresy, and Arius himself was vilified in official histories. Yet for decades, he had significant influence. Entire regions followed his teachings. The rewriting of history didn't just protect the Church's theological position, it erased the memory of real political and spiritual struggles that shaped early Christianity. Similarly, in Hinduism, many local deities and traditions were absorbed or replaced over time. As kingdoms consolidated and religious authorities sought to unify populations under a coherent framework, countless local gods, rituals, and stories were either integrated into larger narratives or quietly discarded. What survives today in texts like the Puranas is the product of centuries of editing, reinterpretation, and sometimes political maneuvering. The religion appears ancient and monolithic, but the historical reality is far more complex and contested. Even the Bible itself contains traces of revision. Scholars have noted repeated sections, conflicting genealogies, and inconsistencies in narratives that suggest multiple sources were woven together over time. Editors often smoothed contradictions, omitted unflattering details, or emphasized moral lessons over historical accuracy. The result is a text that reads as coherent and authoritative, but beneath the surface, it reflects centuries of human decisions about what to remember and what to forget. Religious history also manipulates memory through ritual repetition. Annual commemorations, holy days, and festivals reinforce specific versions of the past while ignoring others. When communities gather to reenact sacred events, the story becomes more than just history, it becomes lived experience. Over time, repetition solidifies belief and marginalizes alternative perspectives. People internalize the curated version of history, and the edited past becomes a foundation for identity, morality, and social cohesion. One subtle but powerful tool in the rewriting of history is the reinterpretation of language. Words are flexible, and religious institutions often exploit this. Terms like miracle, prophecy, or revelation are loaded with cultural and theological weight, framing events in ways that reinforce faith. A natural phenomenon becomes divine intervention, a political success becomes a moral triumph, and a failed campaign becomes a test of faith. In every case, language shapes perception, turning subjective interpretation into what feels like objective memory. The rewriting of history is not always violent or overt. Sometimes it is as simple as emphasizing victories and ignoring defeats. In Islamic history, for instance, the early caliphates are often remembered for their conquests and administration, while internal conflicts, dissent, and political manipulation receive less attention. Textbooks, sermons, and popular media selectively highlight episodes that inspire loyalty, courage, and devotion, while the messier realities fade into obscurity. What the faithful remember is not an unbiased record, but a carefully curated narrative. This pattern repeats in virtually every major religion. Saints are remembered for virtues and miracles. Their political or personal failings are minimized. Founders are depicted as infallible, despite historical evidence of compromise, negotiation, or failure. Communities are taught a version of the past that emphasizes moral clarity and divine guidance, often at the expense of historical complexity. And because humans are naturally drawn to coherent narratives, these edited histories are far more compelling and far more resistant to challenge than messy, contradictory reality. There's also a sociological angle to consider. Religion relies on collective memory to maintain cohesion. If believers begin to doubt the past, the present authority of the institution is undermined. Questioning one historical claim often leads to questioning others, creating a chain reaction that can destabilize entire communities. The incentive to rewrite, simplify, and glorify history is therefore not just about piety, it is about survival. By controlling the past, religious institutions maintain control over identity, morality, and social order. Psychologists call this phenomenon motivated memory, a natural tendency to remember what aligns with one's beliefs and forget what challenges them. Religious institutions amplify this tendency. They provide rituals, teachings, and cultural reinforcement that ensure believers internalize the curated narrative. Over generations, the distinction between history and myth blurs. The past is no longer a record of events. It is a story designed to sustain faith, shape identity, and enforce obedience. Some of the most fascinating cases occur when texts are rediscovered that contradict the established narrative. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, revealed sects and beliefs in Judaism that had been marginalized or erased from mainstream memory. Early Christian texts, like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Mary, challenge canonical accounts and suggest that early religious history was far more diverse than orthodox narratives suggest. These discoveries illuminate the editorial choices made over centuries and expose the mechanisms by which religions protect themselves by curating memory. Ultimately, the rewriting of history is about control, not just of information, but of interpretation. By shaping memory, religions shape morality, authority, and social cohesion. By presenting a polished, coherent past, they create a framework that justifies existing hierarchies, consolidates power, and preserves belief. And yet, even with all the editing, the gaps, contradictions, and forgotten stories remain, waiting to be uncovered by anyone willing to question, explore, and look beyond the curated narrative. One of the most effective ways religion rewrites history is through its relationship with archaeology. When ancient artifacts or ruins are discovered, they are rarely neutral. Every discovery is filtered through interpretation, and religious institutions often guide that interpretation to fit pre-existing narratives. A temple becomes proof of divine favor, a ruler's tomb confirms biblical accounts, or a city's destruction is framed as punishment from God. The underlying patterns of human society, economics, and politics are often ignored or downplayed in favor of supernatural explanations. Take the case of Jericho, one of the most cited examples in biblical archaeology. For decades, scholars debated whether the city's walls fell as the Bible describes. Archaeologists who suggested a more mundane collapse due to natural causes were often met with skepticism or resistance from religious communities invested in the miraculous narrative. Evidence was interpreted selectively, highlighted when it seemed to confirm scripture, and overlooked when it contradicted it. The story of Jericho illustrates how archaeology can be co-opted to reinforce a curated version of history. The same is true in Christian Europe. Medieval cathedrals, manuscripts, and relics were often used to create a sense of continuity with biblical history. Charters, chronicles, and even physical artifacts were framed as evidence of an unbroken divine plan. Scholars or chroniclers who challenged these narratives risked marginalization or censorship. The past was not merely recorded, it was constructed, brick by brick, story by story, to support the authority of the church. Religion also manipulates history through science, or at least through its public perception. The conflict between religious narratives and scientific evidence is often framed as a moral or philosophical issue rather than an empirical one. When fossils, astronomy, or climate data contradict sacred texts, the response is rarely wholesale acceptance. Instead, explanations are invented, interpretations are reframed, and the original story is preserved in essence, if not in letter. Creationism, intelligent design, and other frameworks are not just beliefs. They are mechanisms for maintaining continuity in the face of evidence. They protect history as interpreted through faith. Modern media and popular culture continue this process. Movies, television, and even textbooks often present sanitized versions of religious history. Crusades become moral adventures, inquisitions become distant moral lessons, and controversial theological debates are condensed into neat, unthreatening narratives. The public absorbs these versions as reality, reinforcing collective memory that mirrors the curated past, rather than historical fact. The rewriting of history has migrated from scripture to culture itself, ensuring that generations continue to inherit a polished narrative. One striking modern example is the treatment of the Holocaust-era complicity of certain religious institutions. For decades, some churches minimized or reframed their historical involvement, presenting themselves primarily as protectors or rescuers, rather than as institutions with complex, sometimes complicit roles. Documents, records, and testimonies existed, but official narratives often emphasized piety and moral courage over the inconvenient truths. The rewriting of this history doesn't just sanitize the past, it reinforces the moral authority of the institution in the present. Another subtle tool is the way religious education shapes memory. Children learn religious history not as a contested, debated field, but as a set of fixed truths, founding stories, key figures, and miraculous events are presented as facts, rarely contextualized within the messy realities of human behavior. By controlling early exposure to history, institutions shape perception, creating adults whose collective memory aligns with the curated narrative. Contradictory evidence becomes psychologically difficult to accept because it clashes with decades of reinforced belief. Even miracles and supernatural claims serve the purpose of historical control. When an event is framed as miraculous, the ordinary causes, political, social, environmental, are erased from memory. The interpretation of history becomes moralized, filtered through divine lens, and made emotionally compelling. People remember the story as a demonstration of God's power, not as a complex human event shaped by multiple factors. Over centuries, these interpretations accumulate, producing a layered history that bears little resemblance to objective reality. Religious rewriting also extends to the very understanding of time. Calendar systems, sacred anniversaries, and liturgical cycles encode history into lived experience. Observances commemorate victories, martyrdoms, and foundational events, but they rarely acknowledge alternative perspectives or inconvenient truths. The past is ritualized, repeated, and absorbed into identity, creating a sense of inevitability and permanence. History is no longer merely a record. It becomes an instrument for shaping morality, loyalty, and belief. And yet, despite all these mechanisms, evidence persists. Inscriptions, coins, artifacts, and manuscripts occasionally break through the curated narratives. Scholars uncover contradictions, suppressed text, and neglected accounts. The tension between what happened and what is remembered illustrates the ongoing struggle between reality and narrative. History is messy, but religion has always sought to smooth the edges, presenting a coherent story that reinforces faith, authority, and moral order. In this sense, religion doesn't simply protect itself, it actively shapes reality for the believer. The curated past becomes the lens through which the present is interpreted and the future imagined. Every ritual, text, and commemoration reinforces this narrative, embedding it deeply into culture and consciousness. The rewriting of history is not a marginal activity. It is central to the survival, influence, and coherence of faith. Religion's rewriting of history is not confined to texts, rituals, or artifacts. It extends into the political and social sphere, shaping how entire civilizations remember their past. Wars fought in the name of faith are often recast as moral triumphs rather than the brutal contests they were. Victories are celebrated, defeats minimized or blamed on human weakness, and the role of religion in both is framed as righteous guidance rather than strategic interest. By controlling the narrative, religious institutions control how societies interpret their own past. Take the Crusades, for example. Popular depictions often frame them as noble missions to defend or reclaim holy sites. Chronicles and sermons from the period portray them as divine adventures, emphasizing piety, heroism, and the will of God. Yet contemporary accounts, archaeological evidence, and modern scholarship reveal a far more complicated story. Political maneuvering, economic motives, and widespread violence against civilians. The version passed down through religious memory is selective, designed to justify authority, inspire loyalty, and morally validate acts that, in reality, were complex and often brutal. Religious rewriting also extends to revolutions and reformations. When communities resist authority, faith often positions itself as a stabilizing force. Events that threaten the institution's power are framed as disorder, sin, or divine punishment. Leaders who challenge orthodoxy are remembered as rebels or heretics rather than agents of legitimate change. By shaping historical memory, religion ensures that dissent is not just dangerous in the present, it is delegitimized in the past as well. The lesson becomes clear. Questioning faith risks repeating the mistakes of history. This mechanism is amplified through social structures. Education, family traditions, and communal storytelling all reinforce curated narratives. Children learn history as a set of moral lessons rather than an empirical record. Sacred texts are presented as authoritative. Ritual observances commemorate select events, and deviations from the accepted story are ignored or condemned. Over generations, this creates a population whose memory aligns closely with the version sanctioned by religious institutions. Psychologically, this works because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We crave coherence and moral clarity. When the past is presented as neat, righteous, and purposeful, it satisfies a deep cognitive need. Religion exploits this by shaping collective memory to align with its own values and authority. In effect, the edited past becomes a lens through which the present is interpreted and the future imagined. It is not just memory, it is a tool of social and moral engineering. Yet cracks appear. Modern scholarship, archaeology, and comparative religious studies continually challenge curated narratives. Lost texts are rediscovered, inscriptions contradict established stories, and scientific evidence reveals discrepancies. The careful construction of religious history faces the reality that human evidence is persistent, stubborn, and often inconvenient. And when these cracks widen, believers are faced with choices: reinterpret, adapt, or confront the uncomfortable reality that the past was shaped by human motives, not divine design. The tension between faith and historical truth is ongoing. Religious institutions are skilled at adapting narratives to preserve authority. Miracles can be reframed, contradictory texts reinterpreted, and inconvenient evidence incorporated as allegory. This adaptability ensures survival, but it also highlights a crucial point. History within religion is rarely objective. It is a curated story, shaped by those with the most to protect: power, influence, and the cohesion of belief itself. Ultimately, understanding how religion rewrites history is more than an academic exercise. It reveals the mechanisms by which authority is maintained, belief is reinforced, and societies are shaped. It shows that the past we inherit is not always a record of what happened, but a carefully edited story designed to sustain faith and influence. And it reminds us that truth is often layered, obscured by centuries of narrative shaping. The lesson is subtle but powerful. By examining the discrepancies, the omissions, and the reinterpretations, we can begin to see the human hand behind sacred narratives. We can appreciate the skill, intention, and necessity of this rewriting, but also recognize that it is a rewriting nonetheless. The past is not frozen in stone. It is malleable, contested, and often shaped to serve ends beyond mere truth. And in recognizing that, we reclaim a part of history for reason, evidence, and inquiry. History is not owned by any institution, no matter how ancient or revered. The stories religion preserves are valuable, not as immutable truth, but as reflections of human belief, ambition, and memory. By understanding how narratives are curated, we gain insight into both the power of faith and the power of critical thought. We see that while religions may seek to control memory, the evidence of the past remains, waiting for those willing to explore, question, and understand it. In the end, religion's greatest skill is not in inspiring belief, but in controlling remembrance. It smooths contradictions, erases inconvenient details, and frames events to reinforce authority. Yet history persists beyond its reach. Artifacts endure, texts survive, scientific evidence continues to emerge. And for those willing to look beyond curated stories, the real history, messy, human, and unedited, offers a richer, more profound understanding of both the past and the nature of belief itself.